Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to Mr. Night Whisperer TT. Tonight, I want to take you into one of the darkest cases in American crime history. A case that doesn't just horrify because of the brutality, but because of the long years it remained hidden in plain sight. This is the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, the so-called Milwaukee cannibal. Over the course of more than a decade, he murdered and dismembered at least 17 young men and boys. But before the headlines, before the courtroom confessions, there was just a quiet boy, withdrawn, awkward, and strangely fascinated by death. I invite you to sit back, let the pace slow down, and let me guide you carefully through his beginnings. We'll move together, piece by piece, so you can understand how this man came to be. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The household from the outside seemed ordinary. His father, Lionel, was a chemist, often absorbed in his work. His mother, Joyce, battled depression and illness, and the home was marked by frequent arguments. As a child, Jeffrey was described as shy, even painfully so. He had trouble connecting with other children, and while his peers were out playing sports or running through backyards, Dahmer developed a strange hobby, collecting animal bones. He would scour the woods for roadkill, fascinated not by the suffering of the animals, but by their remains. The structure of bones, the idea of what lay beneath the skin. His father once showed him how acid could be used to clean bones, and instead of recoiling, Jeffrey was mesmerized. It became, in a way, his first experiment with the relationship between life, death, and decay. As he grew older, isolation became more pronounced. His classmates recall a boy who was awkward, often on the edges of groups, rarely speaking unless prompted. There were early warning signs, but they seemed to fade into the background of a troubled home. The constant fighting between his parents left him retreating further into himself. By the time Jeffrey reached his teenage years, alcohol had already entered his life. He began drinking heavily, even during school hours, smuggling beer or hard liquor into class. Teachers noticed, but they often wrote it off as another case of a troubled youth. He blended in just enough to escape scrutiny. Something I always find unsettling when looking back is how invisible he seemed. There's a chilling fact here. One of his high school photos actually shows him holding a cup, with rumors suggesting it contained alcohol. It wasn't just that he drank, it was that he was already masking, already hiding in plain sight, already perfecting the art of seeming unremarkable. Looking deeper, scholars and psychologists have debated whether Dahmer was born with something broken inside him, or whether his environment shaped what he would become. Some argue that the neglect, the instability at home, and his social isolation created a void that twisted into something dark. Others insist that neurological factors or a predisposition toward paraphilia made his trajectory inevitable. There's no simple answer, and maybe that's what makes the story so haunting. Around the age of 14, Dahmer realized he was gay. This was the 1970s in Midwest America, a time and place where being openly homosexual was met with prejudice and hostility. He kept his attraction hidden, internalized, and mingled with his feelings of isolation. But soon, his fantasies took on a disturbing edge. He imagined dominating men, controlling them so they could never leave him. In his mind, love and possession blurred into something far darker. The years leading up to his first murder were deceptively calm. He graduated high school in 1978, barely. By then, his parents' marriage had collapsed. His father moved out, and his mother relocated with his younger brother, leaving Jeffrey alone in the family home. He was just 18 years old, abandoned in a quiet suburban house filled with silence. And it was in that silence that his thoughts grew louder. The fantasies of control, of possession, of bodies that couldn't walk away became more consuming. He drank more heavily, numbing himself, but the urge didn't fade. There's a moment from his teenage years that often gets overlooked. He would sometimes invite classmates over, but instead of hanging out, he wanted to dissect roadkill or show off jars of preserved animals. To his peers, it was bizarre, even grotesque. But for Dahmer, it was another way of feeling in control, another way of making the lifeless stay with him. One evening in 1978, only weeks after graduation, Dahmer gave in to that urge for the first time. But that's a story we'll explore fully in the next part. For now, remember this. Jeffrey Dahmer began not as the monster splashed across news headlines, but as a lonely young man, surrounded by dysfunction, consumed by alcohol, and quietly obsessed with the permanence of death. Before I move on, let me leave you with a thought that always lingers with me. How many warning signs do we ignore in the people around us, simply because we can't imagine what they might become? By the summer of 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer had already developed a thick shell of loneliness. His parents were gone, his classmates had drifted away, and alcohol was his only companion. He was 18, left alone in that quiet house on West Bath Road, and one evening in June, he encountered someone who would become his first victim. Stephen Hicks was hitchhiking along the road, a cheerful 19-year-old with long hair and a guitar. He was on his way to a rock concert, looking for a ride. Dahmer pulled over. To anyone else, this could have been an ordinary act of kindness, a young man offering another a lift. But for Jeffrey, something shifted in that moment. Hicks represented companionship, a chance to hold on to someone who wouldn't walk away. Jeffrey invited him back to the empty house for a few beers before the concert. Hicks agreed, probably thinking it was nothing more than a friendly detour. The two spent hours drinking and talking. But as the evening wore on, Hicks began to get restless. He wanted to leave, to continue on to the concert. For Jeffrey, that was unbearable. The idea of being left alone again after feeling a spark of connection was more than he could tolerate. So he acted. He grabbed a dumbbell, one of the weights he kept in the house, and struck Hicks from behind. The blow stunned him, but it wasn't enough. Jeffrey then pressed the bar across Hicks' right throat, holding it down until the young man stopped moving. It was sudden, brutal, final. I have to pause here. Imagine being 18 years old and your first murder unfolds not from rage, but from the desperation to keep someone from leaving. It's disturbing, but it tells us so much about the psychology that would define Dahmer's crimes for years to come. Control, possession, the refusal to let go. After the killing, Dahmer stood in the silence of the house, staring at what he had done. Hicks's body lay there, and Dahmer had crossed the line he could never return from. Panic set in, but so did an eerie calm. He dragged the body to the basement, dismembered it methodically, and placed the remains in garbage bags. Over the next few days, he dissolved some of the remains with acid and smashed the bones into fragments, scattering them in the woods behind the house. What strikes me most is how quickly he adapted. He didn't collapse, he didn't confess, he didn't even hesitate for long. He covered up the crime with efficiency, almost as if he had rehearsed it in his mind countless times. And in many ways, he had. This first murder, though, didn't trigger a killing spree right away. Instead, it hung in the air like a shadow over the next 9 years of his life. He drank more heavily, dropped out of Ohio State University after one semester, and eventually enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1979. For a while, it looked like discipline and structure might pull him back from the edge, but his alcoholism followed him overseas to Germany, where he served as a medic. There's an unsettling fact here. Fellow soldiers later accused Dahmer of sexually assaulting them while they were stationed abroad. At the time, those reports didn't lead to serious consequences. He was discharged after 2 years due to his drinking. Looking back, it feels like another moment when intervention might have changed the trajectory. But once again, he slipped through. By 1981, Dahmer returned to Ohio, but his life unraveled quickly. His father tried to help, enrolling him in a detox program, but Jeffrey's addiction only deepened. Soon, he moved in with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. For a time, her house provided stability. He found work, attended church with her, and seemed to be trying to rebuild. But the urges were never far behind. What fascinates criminologists about this period is the gap, nearly a decade between his first and second confirmed murders. Some believe Dahmer committed other killings during that time, ones never linked to him. Others suggest that his drinking and constant movement delayed his impulses. Whatever the case, the silence didn't mean safety. It was only the calm before a storm. Scholars debate whether Dahmer's first murder was a kind of psychological tipping point. Did killing Hicks open a door he could never close, or was it merely the first time he acted on desires already locked in place? Some argue the 9-year gap suggests hesitation, even guilt. Others counter that the elaborate concealment of Hicks' body proves Dahmer felt no remorse, only a need to refine his methods. Personally, I think it's both. I think the act terrified him and thrilled him at the same time. He buried it beneath alcohol, beneath routines, but the memory never left him. And when the chance came again, he wouldn't hesitate. The murder of Stephen Hicks was, in hindsight, a beginning that could have been an end. If authorities had discovered the remains, if someone had connected the dots, if Dahmer had faced justice then, 17 more lives might have been spared. But they didn't, and the shadow grew darker. Next time, we'll step into those years of silence and see how Dahmer carried this secret with him, waiting for the moment when his compulsion would return. After Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey Dahmer carried a secret that no one around him suspected. He had taken a life, dismembered a body, and gotten away with it. But instead of immediately continuing, he seemed to go quiet. For nearly 9 years, he lived with the memory of that first killing, and during that time, his life looked like it was falling apart from the outside in. He enrolled at Ohio State University in the fall of 1978. His father had hoped it would give him purpose, a way forward after the chaos of his parents' divorce. But Jeffrey spent most of his time drinking. He rarely attended classes, and when he did, he often arrived intoxicated. By the end of his first semester, his grades had collapsed, and he dropped out. Lionel Dahmer, desperate to find discipline for his son, suggested the army. In January 1979, Jeffrey enlisted and was assigned to the medical corps. For a brief time, it looked like he might have found a path. He was stationed in Germany, working as a medic. He learned procedures, handled responsibility, and received a steady paycheck. But alcohol followed him across the Atlantic. Other soldiers would later come forward with chilling claims. 2 of them accused Dahmer of drugging and sexually assaulting them. At the time, the military did not pursue these allegations. Dahmer's drinking spiraled until he was deemed unfit for service. In 1981, he received an honorable discharge, not for heroism, but simply because they wanted him gone. Back in the United States, his decline accelerated. He briefly lived in Miami, trying to escape his habits, but the pattern repeated. He drank his wages away and ended up returning to Ohio. Within months, police arrested him for drunken and disorderly conduct. His father attempted to help, enrolling him in a program, but it failed. Soon, Jeffrey moved to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. This was an important period in his life. Living with his grandmother offered stability, regular meals, church on Sundays, and a home where he wasn't entirely alone. Neighbors described him as polite, even shy. He found work at a blood plasma center and later at a chocolate factory. But beneath this seemingly quiet existence, the old urges were surfacing again. At night, Dahmer began visiting gay bars in Milwaukee. He was still closeted, still hiding his sexuality from his family. But in these bars, he found men who were willing to spend time with him. Yet even these encounters left him restless. He didn't want companionship that could end. He wanted permanence. There's a strange fact that stands out here. Dahmer was once arrested for indecent exposure in 1982 after drunkenly flashing a group of people at a state fair. Just 2 years later, in 1986, he was caught masturbating in front of two boys near the Kinnickinnic River. That conviction led to a year of probation. Each time, the justice system brushed past him, treating these incidents as isolated acts of public indecency rather than signals of something far darker. Criminologists often debate this phase of Dahmer's life. Was he struggling against his compulsions, trying to find a way to control them? Or was he refining them, slowly testing the boundaries of what he could get away with? Some point to his assaults in the army and his arrests as signs that his predatory behavior was escalating, even if the murders had temporarily stopped. Others argue that alcoholism was the only thing holding him back, that in those years he was too consumed by addiction to carry out his fantasies. For Dahmer himself, later in interviews, he admitted that the desire to kill never truly went away. It was always there, simmering under the surface. He confessed that his fantasy life became more elaborate in these years. He imagined keeping men with him forever, imagined controlling them in ways they couldn't resist. He sought mannequins, even stealing one from a store, bringing it home for companionship until his grandmother discovered it and forced him to discard it. That moment, small as it may sound, shows how the line between fantasy and reality was already crumbling. By 1987, he was 27 years old. He had carried the weight of his first murder for nearly a decade, but the silence was about to end. His drinking was worse, his loneliness deeper, and his fantasies more consuming. On a November night in Milwaukee, he would cross the line again. The victim was Stephen Tuomi, and unlike the first time, Dahmer wouldn't just dispose of the body. He would begin shaping the ritual that defined his later crimes. But before we step into that hotel room and the horrors that followed, I want to pause for a moment. Think of how many opportunities existed for someone to stop him. The Army's failure to investigate assaults, the courts treating his behavior as minor offenses, the family overlooking red flags. None of it stopped what was coming. By the time 1987 arrived, Jeffrey Dahmer's life had narrowed to three things: drinking, loneliness, and fantasy. He was working at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory in Milwaukee, living still with his grandmother, but his nights were increasingly filled with bars, strangers, and the gnawing thought that control was slipping further and further away. He had held back from killing again for nearly 9 years, but that restraint was about to end. It happened in late November at a downtown Milwaukee hotel. Dahmer met a 25-year-old man named Stephen Tuomi at a bar. Tuomi was described by friends as warm, outgoing, someone who trusted too easily. Dahmer offered to pay for a night together at the hotel, and Tuomi agreed. For Dahmer, it was never just about company. The urge to possess, to keep someone forever, was growing stronger. They checked into room 507 of the Ambassador Hotel, the night blurred with alcohol. Dahmer later claimed he blacked out, that he couldn't remember the moment itself. When he woke the next morning, Tuomi was dead. His chest was crushed, his face beaten. Jeffrey's knuckles were bruised, his hands aching. This is where the story takes a sharp turn. Instead of panicking, instead of calling for help, Dahmer calmly accepted what had happened. He bought a large suitcase, placed Tuomi's body inside, and transported it back to his grandmother's basement. Over the next week, he dismembered the body, carefully removing flesh and bone, keeping the skull as a memento. Later, when decomposition set in, even that trophy was destroyed. It's worth pausing on that detail. Dahmer claimed he didn't intend to kill Tuomi, that it just happened. Some scholars argue this was self-deception, that the planning, renting the room, bringing him back, buying the suitcase, shows clear intent. Others suggest it was the beginning of something Dahmer himself hadn't fully understood, that once he crossed that line, the killings became less about impulse and more about ritual. The murder of Tuomi was pivotal. With Stephen Hicks in 1978, Dahmer's focus had been disposal, how to erase the evidence. With Tuomi, his focus shifted. He lingered with the body, studied it, experimented with preservation. He admitted later that he found comfort in the silence of the corpse, in knowing that the person could no longer leave him. And here is where his fantasy life began to merge completely with reality. The mannequin he had once kept hidden in his room had been discarded, but now he had what he truly wanted, a body he could control. After Tuomi, the killings came faster. Within months, young men began disappearing from the Milwaukee area. James Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, and others. But each of those cases built directly on what he learned in Room 507. The transition from accident to intent, from fear to experimentation. One chilling fact, police never located Tuomi's remains. Unlike later victims, whose bones, photographs, and skulls were recovered, Tuomi's body was completely destroyed. This has left scholars debating whether Dahmer was telling the truth about not remembering the act. Did he really wake up to find Tuomi dead, or did he consciously choose to eliminate every trace, ensuring no one would ever know? What is undeniable is that Tuomi's death marked the end of Dahmer's so-called dormant years. It was the spark that reignited the cycle. From then on, the line between fantasy and reality was gone forever. Before we move deeper into his spree, I want to invite you, if you've stayed with me so far, take a moment to breathe. And if you'd like to keep unraveling cases that linger in the dark corners of history, consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing. That way, these stories can continue to find their way to you. And tell me, if you feel like sharing, where are you listening from tonight? What's the hour on your clock as you hear this story? I always find it fascinating to know how these tales reach across places and time zones. Next, we'll follow Dahmer into 1988 and beyond, where young men would continue to vanish, and the pattern of his ritual killings would begin to emerge in full. After the murder of Stephen Tuomi, Jeffrey Dahmer had crossed into a new stage of his life, one where killing no longer felt like an accident or a moment of drunken loss of control. It became purposeful. He had found a way to act on his fantasies, and he discovered that the aftermath, the possession, the dismemberment, the silence of the dead, was exactly what he craved. In January 1988, his compulsion surfaced again. His next known victim was James Dockstader, a 14-year-old boy from Milwaukee. Dahmer lured him with the promise of money in exchange for posing for photographs. It was a tactic he would use repeatedly in the years to come, offering small amounts of cash to young men and teenagers, most of them vulnerable, many of them from marginalized backgrounds. Dahmer brought Dockstader back to his grandmother's house. Once there, he drugged him, strangled him, and kept the body hidden for a day before dismembering it. Just like with Tuomi, he attempted to preserve parts of the body, experimenting with methods that could allow him to keep trophies without detection. The remains of James Dockstader were never recovered. Only a few months later, in March of 1988, Dahmer struck again. This time, the victim was Richard Guerrero, a 22-year-old man he met outside a Milwaukee bar. Again, the offer was photographs. Again, the method was drugging and strangulation. Guerrero's remains, too, were never found. By now, Dahmer had fallen into a pattern. Lure, drug, kill, dismember, conceal. His grandmother's house became the setting of these crimes. She noticed strange odors coming from the basement and garage. But Jeffrey always had excuses: spoiled meat, dead animals, taxidermy experiments. She believed him. What's haunting is how ordinary the house must have seemed from the outside, A grandmother living with her grandson, a quiet home in West Dallas. Neighbors saw nothing unusual. Yet inside, Dahmer was experimenting with dismemberment, storing bones, and hiding skulls. By September of 1988, suspicion finally caught up with him, but not for murder. That month, Dahmer was arrested after luring a 13-year-old boy named Somsak Synthasamphone, offering him money to pose for nude photos. The boy escaped, and Dahmer was charged with sexual exploitation and second-degree sexual assault. Here is where the system failed catastrophically. While awaiting sentencing, Dahmer continued his predatory behavior. In March of 1989, just months before serving his sentence, he lured and killed another victim, Anthony Sears, a 24-year-old aspiring model. Sears was different for Dahmer. He preserved his skull and genitals, hiding them as keepsakes. When sentencing for the assault of the 13-year-old finally came, the court gave Dahmer 5 years of probation and 1 year in a work release program, allowing him to keep his job at the chocolate factory while serving time at night. His father begged the judge for stricter consequences, even suggesting treatment in a structured environment. But the court, convinced Dahmer was remorseful, opted for leniency. This is one of the most fiercely debated points among criminologists and legal scholars. Some argue that stricter punishment at this stage might have interrupted his cycle, forcing him into rehabilitation, or at least keeping him under closer watch. Others counter that Dahmer's compulsions were already too entrenched, that nothing short of lifelong incarceration would have stopped him. The tragedy, of course, is that Anthony Sears had already been murdered by the time Dahmer entered custody. His probation and brief incarceration didn't stop him. It only delayed him. There's an odd fact here that rarely gets mentioned. While serving his work release sentence, Dahmer's behavior was described as quiet, compliant, even respectful. To the guards, he was just another inmate who wanted to serve his time and move on. They never suspected that he had trophies of human remains waiting for him back in his grandmother's house. When he was released in 1990, he didn't return to his grandmother's home. Instead, he moved into the now infamous Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee. It was there that his crimes escalated to their most horrifying level. But those early murders, Doxtator, Guerrero, Sears, reveal a crucial shift. Hicks had been a desperate attempt to stop someone from leaving. Tuomi may have been a drunken blackout. But by 1988, Dahmer was luring victims with planning, killing them deliberately, and preserving body parts as tokens. The line between fantasy and reality had vanished completely. I sometimes think about the fact that he lived in that house with his grandmother, killing and dismembering young men in secret while she prayed in the next room. It's one of those disturbing contrasts that makes this story so chilling. How normal life continued on the surface while something monstrous grew beneath it. By the time Jeffrey Dahmer moved into the Oxford Apartments in 1990, his fantasies had become a fully structured reality. He no longer needed excuses, no longer had to hide behind his grandmother's house. The new apartment at 924 North 25th Street was his sanctuary, a place where he could kill, experiment, and keep what he wanted. Apartment 213 would become infamous, but at first glance, it looked like any other unit in the low-income building. A small one-bedroom with plain furniture, some art on the walls, a fish tank, a mattress on the floor. Neighbors described Dahmer as quiet, withdrawn, and sometimes friendly if approached. Nobody suspected that behind his door were remains stored in drawers, a refrigerator holding human flesh, and skulls arranged like ornaments. One of his first known victims after moving in was Raymond Smith, also known as Ricky, a 32-year-old man Dahmer met on May 20th, 1990. Dahmer lured him with the same promise of money for photographs. After drugging and strangling him, Dahmer painted Smith's skull and preserved it as part of his growing collection. Over the next year, the pace of Dahmer's murders increased. Ernest Miller, a 22-year-old dancer, was killed in September 1990. Curtis Straughter, a 17-year-old, followed in February 1991. Then came Errol Lindsay, a 19-year-old, in April 1991. Lindsay's murder is particularly unsettling because it revealed Dahmer's shifting desires. Unlike some of his other victims, Lindsay didn't fit Dahmer's usual type. He was heterosexual, and Dahmer admitted that what fascinated him wasn't the sexual aspect, but the idea of creating a permanent, compliant partner. This is when Dahmer began experimenting with crude lobotomies, drilling holes into the skulls of his victims and injecting chemicals in an attempt to create what he later called zombies. It's one of the most chilling aspects of his crimes. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted possession without resistance. He wanted to erase free will, leaving a body alive but devoid of autonomy. Lindsay's case was his first attempt. It failed, as all of his attempts would, but it showed just how far Dahmer's fantasies had evolved. During this time, neighbors began to notice things. They complained about the smell coming from his apartment. Dahmer explained it away with stories about spoiled meat, tropical fish dying, or his habit of cooking exotic recipes. The building manager accepted these explanations. Police officers were even called more than once, but no one investigated thoroughly. Here lies one of the deepest failures in the case, and one that has been studied and debated in academic circles for decades. Why did no one look deeper? Some criminologists argue it was negligence rooted in systemic bias. Dahmer's victims were predominantly men of color, often from marginalized communities. Reports from neighbors, many of them black, were dismissed as exaggerations. Others argue that the late 1980s and early 1990s culture around homosexuality played a role, with officers reluctant to get involved in what they viewed as domestic disputes between men. There's a strange and disturbing fact about this period. Dahmer was actually friends with some of his neighbors. A woman named Pamela Bass, who lived in the building, once accepted a sandwich from him. She later admitted she sometimes wondered if it had human flesh in it, though Dahmer himself denied feeding his neighbors any of his victims. That image of neighbors casually chatting with him, even sharing food, adds another grotesque layer to the story. By mid-1991, Dahmer's killing spree accelerated further. His apartment was becoming a private mausoleum. Human remains were stored in drawers, refrigerators, even cooking pots. He photographed his victims before and after death, building a visual archive that he would revisit for pleasure. In many ways, this was the peak of his control. He had a space of his own, he had refined his methods, and he believed he could keep going indefinitely. But what stands out most when looking at this stage is the system's blindness. Neighbors raised alarms, police had opportunities, courts had already failed once. Dahmer was spiraling deeper, and yet he remained invisible in plain sight. What's haunting is how mundane it all looked. A man walking in and out of his apartment building, carrying grocery bags or trash, greeting neighbors in the hallway, holding down a job at the chocolate factory. But inside that small, one-bedroom apartment, reality was splitting. To Dahmer, the line between life, death, and possession was something he could manipulate with a drill and a syringe. To the rest of the world, he was just another quiet tenant. By the spring and summer of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's world had fully collapsed into his obsession. Apartment 213 was no longer simply a place where he lived. It had become his laboratory, his gallery, his shrine. The killings were more frequent now, nearly back-to-back, as if the brief pauses between them could no longer satisfy him. In May of 1991, he murdered 14-year-old Konarak Sinthasomphone, the younger brother of Somsak, the same boy Dahmer had been convicted of assaulting just 3 years earlier. This case has become infamous not only because of its brutality, but because of how close Konarak came to escaping, and how profoundly the system failed him. Dahmer lured Konarak to his apartment under the pretense of offering money for photographs. After drugging him, Dahmer attempted another of his crude lobotomy procedures, drilling a hole into the boy's skull and injecting hydrochloric acid. He left Konarak in his apartment while he went out for drinks. When Dahmer returned, he found that Konarak had managed to stumble out of the building. Neighbors discovered the boy on the street, disoriented, injured, and nearly naked. They called the police. Officers arrived and neighbors pleaded with them, pointing out the boy's condition. But Dahmer intercepted the situation. Calm, polite, and persuasive, he convinced the officers that Konarak was his 19-year-old lover, drunk after a quarrel. The officers escorted the boy back into Dahmer's apartment, even ignoring the foul smell inside. They left Konarak in Dahmer's custody. Within an hour, Konarak was dead. It is hard to overstate the horror of this moment. 2 police officers had Dahmer's crimes literally in their hands. Had they searched the apartment, they would have found skulls, remains, photographs, evidence that would have ended the spree instantly. Instead, they left, and Dahmer was free to continue killing. This incident remains one of the most debated in criminology and law enforcement studies. Was it incompetence? Was it homophobia? Was it racial bias, given that the boy was Laotian and the neighbors pleading for him were black women? Most scholars agree it was a tragic combination of all three. A failure so profound that Milwaukee police later faced lawsuits, protests, and long-lasting scrutiny. Another unsettling fact: one of the officers who returned Konarak to Dahmer joked afterward on the police radio that they were reuniting lovers. The recording surfaced after Dahmer's arrest, further deepening public outrage. In the weeks following Konarak's death, Dahmer continued his spree. In June of 1991, he murdered Matt Turner and Jeremiah Weinberger. In July, he killed Oliver Lacey and then Joseph Braidhoft. By then, his apartment had turned into what prosecutors would later describe as a house of horrors. Inside were drums filled with acid, refrigerators containing human flesh, and a growing collection of skulls and skeletons. Dahmer spoke later about wanting to build a shrine of skulls, a private altar where he could sit, surrounded by the remains of his victims. He admitted that this fantasy of a shrine, a temple of bones, was what drove him as much as the killings themselves. What's so haunting is the normalcy that surrounded this chaos. Neighbors continued to smell foul odors, continued to complain. Some claimed they even heard the sounds of drills or strange thuds at night. But each time complaints were raised, the explanation stuck. Spoiled food, fish tanks, trash. Nobody believed that in the middle of Milwaukee, in a crowded apartment building, a man was dissecting human beings and keeping parts of them as trophies. By the middle of July 1991, Dahmer's spree was reaching its peak. He was killing at a faster pace, collecting more remains, and losing any semblance of control. He was working less at the chocolate factory, drinking more heavily, and barely keeping his life outside the apartment functioning. This was the point of no return. Dahmer wasn't just killing to satisfy urges anymore. He was killing to maintain the world he had built inside apartment 213. His shrine, his photographs, his trophies, they became the only reality he cared about. And yet, as horrifying as it is to imagine, the end was already near. Within weeks, Dahmer's carefully constructed facade would unravel completely. All it would take was one man escaping through the door that so many others never reached. July 22nd, 1991. That date is seared into the timeline of true crime. After years of murders, after near misses with police, after victims escaping only to be dragged back, it was on this humid summer night in Milwaukee that Jeffrey Dahmer's reign finally came to an end. The man who survived was Tracy Edwards. He was 32 years old, homeless at the time, and had been wandering the city when Dahmer approached him. Dahmer's lure was familiar: money in exchange for photographs. Edwards agreed, perhaps thinking it was just another stranger's offer, nothing more than a way to pass the night and earn a little cash. When they arrived at apartment 213, Edwards noticed the smell immediately. It was thick, cloying, impossible to ignore. Dahmer brushed it off, muttering something about spoiled meat. Edwards also noticed boxes of hydrochloric acid stacked in the corner. Dahmer claimed it was for cleaning bricks. The deeper Edwards was pulled inside, the worse it became. There were photographs on the walls, muscular men, shirtless, posed. But then, in the bedroom, he saw something that made his skin crawl. A blue 57-gallon drum in the corner, with a lid tightly sealed. Dahmer never explained it. Edwards later said Dahmer's demeanor shifted suddenly. He tried to handcuff Edwards, managing to clasp one wrist. When Edwards resisted, Dahmer pulled a large knife from under the bed. The fear was instantaneous. Dahmer forced him into the bedroom, muttering about wanting to possess him, about staying together forever. Edwards, desperate, began talking. Not screaming, not fighting, but talking. He told Dahmer he was his friend. He agreed with whatever Dahmer said, pretending to go along, keeping his voice steady. He knew if he panicked, he was dead. He waited for an opening. After hours of tense conversation, Dahmer's guard slipped. He let Edwards sit with him in the living room, even watched part of The Exorcist III on TV together, a film Dahmer claimed fascinated him. At one point, Dahmer rested his head on Edwards' chest, listening to his heartbeat. He murmured, "I'm going to eat your heart." That was Edwards' breaking point. He waited, patient, until Dahmer was distracted, and then he punched him hard in the face. Edwards ran for the door, the cuffs still clamped to one wrist, and bolted into the street. He flagged down two police officers, Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller. At first, the officers didn't believe him, but Edwards was insistent. A strange man had threatened to kill him, and his apartment was filled with horrors. The officers agreed to investigate. They followed Edwards back to Dahmer's building. When Dahmer answered the door, he was calm, collected, almost polite. But when the officers stepped inside, one of them noticed the smell immediately. Another spotted photographs on a nightstand. They picked them up. What they saw turned their stomachs. They weren't artistic nudes. They were Polaroids of dismembered bodies, arranged in grotesque poses in every stage of death and dissection. The officer turned to his partner and said, "These are real." In that instant, Dahmer realized the game was over. He tried to resist, but was quickly overpowered and handcuffed. The same metal he had tried to use on Tracy Edwards, now closing around his own wrists. When police searched apartment 213, they uncovered a scene that defied imagination. A human head in the refrigerator. A freezer with wrapped packages of flesh. Jars containing preserved organs. The blue drum in the corner held 3 torsos dissolving in acid. 7 skulls, carefully cleaned and arranged, were found throughout the apartment. In total, the remains of 11 victims were recovered that night. Even seasoned detectives wept at the crime scene. One officer later admitted he vomited. Another said it was the most nightmarish discovery of his career. Not just the scale of death, but the calm normalcy of the space. It was an apartment where someone lived, worked, and watched TV, all while surrounded by human remains. The arrest of Dahmer stunned Milwaukee. Neighbors who had long complained about smells were horrified to learn what had been inside. Families of missing men finally had answers, though the answers were worse than they had imagined. Dahmer, meanwhile, seemed almost relieved. In his first interviews with police, he confessed openly, explaining in detail what he had done. He said, "I should be dead for what I did." But his trial was still ahead, and what came next was a battle not only over guilt, but over sanity itself. After Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest in July 1991, Milwaukee was plunged into a storm of shock, horror, and disbelief. The revelations from Apartment 213 spread quickly through newspapers and television reports, and every new detail seemed darker than the last. Families of the missing, many of them having searched for years, were forced to confront the brutal truth. Their sons, brothers, and friends had been murdered, dismembered, and in some cases consumed. Dahmer sat in custody, oddly calm. Detectives who interviewed him described him as cooperative, almost disturbingly polite. He waived his right to a lawyer in the early stages and began speaking freely about the killings. He detailed his methods: the drugs, the drilling into skulls, the preservation of body parts. He admitted to fantasies of building a shrine of bones where he could sit in solitude and feel surrounded by his victims forever. One investigator later said it felt less like questioning a criminal and more like listening to a man confess to sins he was too tired to hide. Dahmer even said, "I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now it's all over." But what over meant was still unclear. His trial would not begin until January of 1992, and in the meantime, investigators had to catalog and process the mountain of evidence from his apartment. Polaroids were laid out across tables in police headquarters. Hundreds of them, each showing a victim at different stages of life and death. Forensic teams pieced together bones, skulls, and remains, trying to match them to missing persons. Families waited desperately for answers. The public reaction was explosive. Communities of color, particularly Black and Asian families, demanded to know how so many young men of theirs could vanish without serious police follow-up. The Konarak Synthosamphone case resurfaced, and outrage boiled over. How could two officers return a drugged 14-year-old boy to Dahmer just weeks before his arrest? Protesters filled the streets. Lawsuits were filed. Trust in Milwaukee police, already strained, shattered further. As the investigation unfolded, prosecutors prepared to charge Dahmer with 17 murders committed between 1978 and 1991. But the real battle would be in court. The question wasn't whether he had killed. His confessions and the physical evidence were overwhelming. The question was whether Jeffrey Dahmer was legally sane. The defense argued he was not. They claimed his acts were driven by uncontrollable impulses, fantasies so overwhelming that he no longer understood right from wrong. They pointed to his necrophilia, his attempts at creating zombies, and his shrine plans as evidence of a mind broken beyond comprehension. The prosecution countered that Dahmer was fully aware of his actions. He lured victims, bought supplies, concealed evidence, and lied to neighbors. He even tried to manipulate police. That, they argued, was not madness. It was calculation. This clash, sanity versus insanity, became the central drama of the trial. Legal scholars still debate it today. Was Dahmer a predator who chose evil with clear awareness? Or was he so deeply disturbed that responsibility itself was murky? An unusual fact adds to the debate. Dahmer told police he didn't kill for hatred or anger. He said he killed because he was afraid of being alone, that his desire was to create men who could never leave him. For some, this sounded like the core of a delusion. For others, it was simply the twisted logic of a killer who valued control above all. As the trial approached, the media frenzy grew. Families of victims prepared to face Dahmer in court. Reporters from around the world descended on Milwaukee. The city braced itself for one of the most disturbing criminal trials in American history. Before we step into that courtroom together, I want to pause for a moment. These stories are heavy, and they linger. If you'd like to keep following them into the darker corners of history, consider supporting this channel by subscribing. It helps me keep these stories alive, and I'm grateful to each of you who listens all the way through. And tell me, where are you listening right now? Maybe in your bedroom, headphones in, lights low, or somewhere unexpected? Drop your place in the comments. It always amazes me to imagine these stories echoing across so many different spaces. Next, we enter the courtroom, where survivors, families, and jurors would sit face to face with Jeffrey Dahmer, and where the law would try to answer, was he sane or was he not? The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began on January 30th, 1992, in Milwaukee County Circuit Court. By that time, the world already knew his name, and the grisly details of his crimes had saturated every headline. But inside the courtroom, the task was not to shock the public. It was to decide whether Dahmer would spend the rest of his life in prison, or whether he would be declared insane and confined to a psychiatric institution. Dahmer himself pled guilty to 15 counts of murder. That plea removed any need for the prosecution to prove he had killed. The evidence was already overwhelming. Instead, the trial narrowed to one critical question. Was he sane when he committed these acts? The prosecution argued yes. They laid out evidence showing Dahmer's calculated methods, the way he lured victims, drugged them, concealed evidence, and lied to police when suspicions were raised. They reminded jurors that Dahmer had moved apartments when his grandmother became suspicious, that he had used excuses to explain away smells and noises. These were not the acts of someone detached from reality. They were the choices of a man who knew what he was doing and worked to avoid detection. The defense countered with psychiatric testimony. They painted Dahmer as a man consumed by uncontrollable urges, whose fantasies of creating zombies and building a shrine of skulls revealed a mind utterly broken. Dr. Fred Berlin, one of the experts, argued that Dahmer's paraphilias, his compulsions tied to necrophilia and control, were so overwhelming that he could not conform his behavior to the law. This clash of expert testimony captivated the courtroom. One psychiatrist would describe Dahmer as methodical, cold, fully aware. Another would counter that he was suffering from a paraphilic disorder so profound that he lived in a fantasy world, detached from the moral framework the rest of society recognized. Meanwhile, families of the victims filled the gallery. Mothers, fathers, siblings. Many of them had spent years wondering where their loved ones were, and now they listened to the details of how they died. Some wept quietly. Others seethed with anger. Every description of a Polaroid, every mention of body parts in the refrigerator was like reopening a wound. Perhaps the most haunting moments came when Dahmer's taped confessions were played. In a calm, almost monotone voice, he explained how he would drug victims, drill into their skulls, and inject acid or boiling water. He described keeping skulls and organs. He talked about eating parts of some victims, not out of hatred, but out of a desire to feel they were a part of him forever. The lack of emotion in his delivery left jurors unsettled. One strange fact about the trial, Dahmer showed very little outward reaction. While families broke down in grief, while experts argued over his sanity, he often sat quietly, head down, listening. At times, he appeared almost relieved, as if the burden of secrecy had been lifted. He even told reporters before the trial, "I deserve whatever I get." Legal scholars have debated the Dahmer trial for decades. Was the insanity defense even appropriate in a case like this? Some argue that Dahmer's crimes were so extreme that labeling him sane was paradoxical. Others insist that acknowledging insanity would have blurred the line between depravity and legal responsibility. In the end, the jury's decision would shape not only Dahmer's fate, but also broader conversations about how the law defines sanity. As the trial moved forward, witnesses described the pain left behind. Families spoke of lost sons and shattered trust. The city itself, once proud of its quiet Midwestern identity, now carried the mark of being home to one of the most infamous killers in history. And the jury, 12 ordinary citizens, had to decide, was Jeffrey Dahmer evil, or was he insane? The courtroom on February 15, 1992, was silent when the jury filed back in. After weeks of testimony, days of expert debates, and hours of deliberation, 12 people were about to decide Jeffrey Dahmer's fate. The verdict: guilty but sane. On all 15 counts of murder, the jury agreed that Dahmer had been fully aware of his actions. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, later extended to 16 after further charges. The total came to 957 years, a symbolic sentence ensuring he would never walk free again. For the families, it was a moment of both relief and anguish. Relief that Dahmer would not escape responsibility. Anguish because no sentence, however long, could restore what was lost. Mothers stood in court clutching photographs of their sons. Some wept quietly. Others stared directly at Dahmer, as if willing him to feel their pain. What came next was even more extraordinary. The judge allowed family members of the victims to address the court directly. These were the victim impact statements, and they remain some of the most powerful moments in American courtroom history. Rita Isbell, the sister of Errol Lindsay, approached the stand. Her voice cracked, then rose with fury. She shouted at Dahmer, telling him she hated him, that he had stolen her brother, that he deserved death. In a moment captured on live television, she lunged toward him, restrained by deputies before she could reach him. The rawness of her grief was unbearable to watch, but it was also profoundly human. Other family members spoke more quietly, but no less powerfully. They talked about sons who were bright, loving, full of potential. They described the agony of years spent searching, not knowing, and then learning the gruesome truth. Their words filled the courtroom with a heaviness that no sentence could lift. And then Dahmer himself spoke. His statement was unusual, subdued, remorseful, almost haunting in its honesty. He said, "I know my time in prison will be terrible, but I deserve it. I know I cannot undo the terrible harm I have caused. I don't even care if I die. I deserve whatever punishment I get." He even asked for God's forgiveness, though few in the courtroom believed he could ever be redeemed. Scholars and commentators have debated Dahmer's final words. Were they genuine? Was he truly remorseful? Or was it another attempt to control how he was perceived? Some argue his calm acceptance of punishment was part of his strange detachment from humanity. Others believe he really was relieved to have been stopped, as he had claimed to police. One peculiar fact: Dahmer specifically asked not to be placed in solitary confinement, even though he was notorious and despised by fellow inmates. He said isolation would worsen his inner demons. Instead, he requested to live among the general prison population. It was an unusual and ultimately fateful decision. As the trial ended and Dahmer was led away, Milwaukee tried to heal. But the questions lingered. How had so many warning signs been missed? How had police failed so profoundly in the Konarak case? And what did Dahmer's crimes reveal about deeper issues? Of race, of homophobia, of the vulnerability of marginalized young men in America? For the victims' families, the answers brought little comfort. Their lives were forever divided into before and after. For Dahmer, the next chapter would unfold inside the walls of Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Before I guide you into those prison walls, let's pause for a moment. If you've stayed with me through this trial, thank you. This isn't easy listening, and I don't take your presence for granted. If you'd like to keep walking with me through these shadowed corridors of true crime, you can support this channel by subscribing. And I'd love to know, what time of day are you with me right now? Is it late into the night, early morning, or somewhere in between? Share it in the comments, because I like picturing how these stories ripple across so many different moments in time. Next, we'll step inside prison, where Dahmer's life continued. Not for long. Under the watchful eyes of guards and the anger of fellow inmates, Jeffrey Dahmer entered Columbia Correctional Institution in 1992. The gray walls and regimented routine were meant to strip away individuality. But for someone like Dahmer, who had already surrendered himself to the state, prison life took on a strange rhythm. At first, authorities placed him in protective isolation. He was infamous, reviled, and vulnerable. But Dahmer didn't want protection. He requested to be placed among the general prison population, saying that solitude only made his mind darker. Officials eventually granted his wish, a decision that would later prove fatal. Inside prison, Dahmer developed habits that unsettled both inmates and staff. He joked about his crimes. He shaped his food into body parts. He drizzled ketchup on them to mimic blood. He would hide them on his tray, then present them suddenly, grinning. For other prisoners, many of whom had lost friends or relatives to violence, it was unbearable. Guards warned him, but Dahmer seemed oddly compelled to mock himself, as though he were daring others to hate him more. And yet, there were signs of change. Dahmer began attending Bible study. He requested baptism. He wrote letters to pastors and expressed regret. Some religious figures believed he was genuinely repentant. Others saw his sudden religiosity as another performance, another mask. One peculiar fact: Dahmer became fascinated with end times prophecy while in prison. He read the book of Revelation repeatedly, claiming he saw parallels between himself and apocalyptic warnings about evil and redemption. Some fellow inmates dismissed it as obsession. Others saw it as proof that his guilt was consuming him. Scholars have debated Dahmer's prison transformation. Was he sincerely remorseful? Did he hope faith could erase what he'd done? Or was he simply grasping for meaning in a life reduced to walls, schedules, and stairs? Psychologists suggest that some offenders, once removed from the cycle of killing, may indeed reflect with real horror on their crimes. Others argue Dahmer's behavior, the jokes, the grotesque reenactments, showed that his pathology never truly left him. By 1994, tensions with other inmates grew worse. Some hated Dahmer not only for his crimes, but also for how he carried himself, making light of horrors, drawing attention. One inmate later said, "He crossed the line too many times. Everyone has a breaking point." In July of that year, another prisoner attempted to cut Dahmer's throat with a makeshift weapon. The attack failed, leaving him shaken but alive. He laughed it off afterward, but the threat was clear. Death could come at any moment. Still, Dahmer carried on. He worked a prison janitorial job. He attended services. He spoke to his parents by phone, sometimes calmly, sometimes with sorrow. His father, Lionel, wrote a book trying to understand his son. His mother, Joyce, wrestled with unbearable guilt, convinced that her son's childhood illnesses, medications, or her own struggles might have set him on this path. Their torment mirrored the larger public question: was Dahmer born this way or made this way? The final chapter was approaching, though no one knew exactly when. In the fall of 1994, Dahmer was assigned to work with two fellow inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. Anderson was serving time for murdering his wife. Scarver had killed a coworker in a bizarre incident involving voices he claimed came from God. On the morning of November 28, 1994, the three men were escorted to a work detail in the prison gymnasium. Guards left them unsupervised for a brief time, a decision that would soon be remembered as a fatal error. Before we step into that moment, let's take a breath. Stories like this remind us how crime doesn't simply end with a trial or a sentence. It seeps forward, leaving ripples in places we don't expect, even behind prison walls. If you're still with me, thank you for listening. You can support this channel by subscribing so we can keep exploring these unsettling stories together. And I'd love to know, if you were given the chance to ask Dahmer just one question, what would it be? Leave it in the comments. I'm curious how you'd confront a mind like his. In the next part, we'll see how Dahmer's life came to an end and how his death raised as many questions as his crimes ever did. The morning of November 28, 1994, began like any other inside Columbia Correctional Institution. The fluorescent lights flickered on, the buzzers echoed through the halls, and inmates shuffled to their assigned duties. For Jeffrey Dahmer, that day meant janitorial work in the prison gym. At around 7:50 a.m., Dahmer, Jesse Anderson, and Christopher Scarver were escorted by guards to their task. The assignment seemed ordinary: clean the showers and toilets. But in those sterile, tiled walls, something was about to happen that would end Dahmer's life forever. The three men were left unsupervised, an unusual lapse in security given Dahmer's notoriety. For nearly 20 minutes, no guard checked in. When they finally did, the scene they found was one of bloody finality. Dahmer lay on the floor, his head crushed by a metal bar taken from prison equipment. Jesse Anderson, too, had been beaten, fatally injured. Standing nearby was Christopher Scarver, calm and almost detached, the murder weapon still in his hands. Scarver later explained why he did it. He said Dahmer mocked others, taunted inmates with sick jokes about cannibalism, and displayed no true remorse. He crossed the line, Scarver told investigators. In later interviews, Scarver added that he believed God had chosen him as an instrument of justice, a statement consistent with his long history of hearing voices and religious delusions. One strange fact: Scarver carried a newspaper clipping in his pocket that detailed Dahmer's crimes. When asked why, he said it reminded him of the evil Dahmer had committed. Some scholars have argued that Scarver was consumed by both rage and obsession, turning himself into a self-appointed executioner. The debate remains unsettled. Was Scarver acting out of genuine moral outrage at Dahmer's behavior in prison? Or was it primarily his mental illness that drove the attack? Psychologists point out that Scarver had been diagnosed with schizophrenia years earlier and often spoke of divine missions. Yet others insist that even unstable men can act out of clear disgust and hatred. Dahmer was rushed to a nearby hospital, but was pronounced dead less than an hour later. He was 34 years old. His death was greeted with a strange mix of reactions across America. Some cheered, some mourned. Others were left with a hollow feeling. Justice had already been served, and this death felt less like closure and more like another violent chapter. For the families of Dahmer's victims, emotions were complex. Some expressed relief that he was gone, no longer able to haunt them in court or in the news. Others admitted disappointment. They wanted him to live out every day of his sentence, forced to reflect on what he had done. One mother said, "His death doesn't bring my son back. Nothing does." In Milwaukee, word of Dahmer's death spread quickly. News stations replayed footage of his trial, his quiet face, his monotone voice. Now, he was gone, killed not by the state, but by another prisoner. Scholars, too, have wrestled with the meaning of Dahmer's violent end. Some argue it represents society's ultimate failure, the prison system unable to protect even its most infamous inmate. Others see it as inevitable, a kind of vigilante justice carried out within the walls where Dahmer had thought he could live out his days in routine. Even in death, Dahmer unsettled the world. His story was not finished. His remains, his brain, even his legacy would spark new controversies. Before we turn to those final disputes about what to do with Dahmer's body, his brain, and the long shadow of his crimes, let's pause here. If you've listened this far, I truly thank you. These stories are heavy, and I try to bring them to you with respect, care, and detail. If you'd like to support this journey further, subscribing means a lot. And tell me, would you rather see Dahmer live out his full sentence? Or do you believe Scarver's act ended things the way they were always destined to? I'm curious how you weigh justice when justice feels incomplete. In our next part, we'll look at the aftermath, how Dahmer's death stirred new arguments, divided his family, and left a permanent scar on Milwaukee's history. In the days after Jeffrey Dahmer's death, chaos and controversy followed. His body was held under state custody, and arguments erupted almost immediately, not about the manner of his death, but about what to do with his remains. The coroner performed an autopsy, confirming the cause: massive head trauma, consistent with being struck multiple times by a heavy metal bar. There was no doubt. Dahmer was dead. But then came the question, what next? Dahmer's parents, Lionel and Joyce, could barely agree on anything. Lionel, his father, wanted Jeffrey's brain preserved for scientific study. He argued that researchers might finally learn what drove his son to kill and maybe help prevent future cases. Joyce, his mother, disagreed. She wanted Jeffrey cremated completely, brain included, insisting that he had suffered enough and that his memory needed to be put to rest rather than dissected further. For months, a bitter legal battle raged. Judges were asked to weigh in on whether Dahmer's brain should be retained or destroyed. Neuroscientists publicly debated the matter too. Some said keeping the brain was pointless. Studying it wouldn't reveal why he killed. Others argued it was a rare opportunity to examine the anatomy of a serial killer at a cellular level. One strange fact often overlooked: at the time of his death, Dahmer had actually requested cremation. He had told prison chaplains and others that he wanted no physical remains left behind, nothing that could turn into a macabre artifact. Yet even his own family couldn't agree on honoring those wishes. In the end, a judge sided with Joyce, and the brain was destroyed. Dahmer was cremated, and his ashes were split between his parents. Lionel scattered part of them in Ohio, near where Jeffrey grew up. Joyce kept her portion privately, refusing to disclose where. Meanwhile, Milwaukee was left to confront its ghosts. The apartment building at 924 North 25th Street, where Dahmer had lived and killed most of his victims, had become a grotesque attraction. People drove by, snapped photos, even stole bricks from the property. Some gawked, some prayed. Others wanted it burned to the ground. In 1992, just after his conviction, the building was demolished. But even years later, the empty lot remained a wound in the city, a reminder of what had happened there. To this day, the site has never been redeveloped. Community leaders said they wanted no chance of anyone profiting from Dahmer's crimes. There's a broader debate here that still unsettles criminologists and sociologists. Should physical reminders of notorious killers be preserved for history or erased to protect survivors? With Dahmer, Milwaukee chose erasure. But the fascination didn't go away. Books, films, documentaries, interviews all kept the memory alive, despite attempts to bury it. Families of the victims struggled too. Some were angry at the media circus following Dahmer's death, feeling it once again centered him rather than their lost loved ones. Others expressed frustration at how quickly people joked about Dahmer, turning their pain into tasteless punchlines. What lingered most was the unanswered question of why. Was Dahmer's compulsion the product of a diseased brain, a traumatic childhood, or something darker and irreducible? Scholars still cannot agree. Some insist neurological factors, like head injuries or abnormalities in brain chemistry, played a role. Others argue it was more about environment, a lack of emotional connection, unresolved trauma, unchecked urges. Even the most careful research hasn't provided a clear answer. Perhaps it never will. And so Dahmer's story ended not with clarity, but with ash, his body gone, his brain destroyed. His apartment erased, yet his name endures, spoken in whispers, debated in classrooms, dramatized on screens. Next, we'll conclude this journey. We'll return to the courtroom, to the verdict, to the punishment that defined his life before Scarver took it, and then slowly we'll lay this case to rest. The final chapter of Jeffrey Dahmer's story rests not in his death, but in the courtroom years earlier, where justice was formally declared and where his fate was sealed. In 1992, after months of trial, testimony, and the chilling display of evidence, Dahmer was found guilty of 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was suffocating. Families of victims sat shoulder to shoulder, clutching tissues, photographs, and each other's hands. Some wept silently. Others stared straight ahead, their eyes fixed on Dahmer, unblinking. The prosecution laid everything bare: the photos, the remains, the confessions. The defense argued insanity, insisting no sane man could commit such acts. But the jury disagreed. After just 5 hours of deliberation, they returned their verdict. Dahmer was sane, and therefore responsible for every act of brutality. The sentence was extraordinary: 15 consecutive life terms, plus a 16th later added in Ohio. That meant more than 900 years in prison, a punishment ensuring he would never breathe free air again. For the victims' families, the sentence was both a relief and a reminder of the endless weight of grief. Judge Lawrence Graham delivered words that still echo: "It is my hope that you can find peace in knowing you will never again see freedom." He emphasized that Dahmer had forfeited any place in society, that the only justice possible was lifelong confinement. One strange fact: Dahmer himself asked not for freedom, not for mercy, but for death. He told the court he wished for his own execution, admitting he could not stop himself, that he deserved nothing less. Wisconsin, however, had abolished the death penalty in 1853, making life imprisonment the only option. Scholars continue to debate whether death might have been a cleaner justice, or whether keeping Dahmer alive forced him to confront his crimes every day. Some criminologists argue that Dahmer's case highlighted deep flaws in law enforcement. Multiple times, police had been called to his building. In one incident, they returned a drugged, bleeding 14-year-old boy to Dahmer's apartment, dismissing neighbors' pleas for help. That child, Konarak Synthasamphone, was killed shortly after. Had officers acted differently, lives might have been saved. This failure became one of the most haunting debates in American policing. Others argue that Dahmer's case underscored the limits of psychiatry and the criminal justice system. How do you identify and stop someone who appears quiet, cooperative, and unthreatening while harboring such darkness inside? When the gavel struck and the sentence was passed, there was no cheering in the courtroom, just silence, heavy and unrelenting. Families left the courthouse with no real victory because no verdict, no prison term could return their children brothers or lovers. Dahmer began his sentence in Columbia Correctional Institution. For 2 years, he lived quietly, working menial jobs, reading the Bible, sometimes receiving letters from strange admirers. Some inmates taunted him, others ignored him. Guards kept a watchful eye. And then, as we've seen, Christopher Scarver ended what the justice system had intended to stretch out for centuries. And so we reach the end of this long, unsettling story. Jeffrey Dahmer's life and crimes remain among the darkest chapters in modern true crime history. His murders scarred families, devastated communities, and forced America to reckon with uncomfortable truths about policing, psychology, and justice. The story doesn't fade, though. His name continues to echo in books, documentaries, classrooms, and whispered conversations. Some study him to understand human darkness. Others avoid the topic altogether, unwilling to stare into that abyss. But tonight, dear listener, we have walked through it together, slowly, carefully, piece by piece. Now I want to leave you gently. We have sat with horror, but we will not carry it into sleep. Think instead of calm air, the sound of your breath, the steadiness of the night around you. These stories are heavy, yes, but you are safe, and this one is over. The case ends here. Sleep well, everyone.